This next paper is entitled Florence Elliott White McClung, Not One of the Boys, by Michael R. Grauer, McCasland Chair of Cowboy Culture and Curator of Cowboy Collections and Western Art at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. He is also the reigning expert on Lloyd Goff. Michael Grauer holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Art History from the University of Kansas, the Master of Arts in Art History from Southern Methodist University, and a Master of Arts in History from West Texas A&M University. He began his career at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and was curator of art and Western heritage and sports equipment at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for 31 years. Michael has curated over 150 exhibitions on Western art, culture, and history, and has authored over 70 publications. In 2020, his book, Making of a Hand, The Art of H.D. Bugbee, received the Western Heritage Wrangler Award for Best Western Art Book. In 2021, he was inducted into the Kansas Cowboy Hall of Fame at Dodge City, Kansas, as a cowboy historian for 2021. Please welcome Michael Grauer.
First of all, a Teamster says yee-haw, not a cowboy. Are we on? Can you all hear me? Well, I'm blessed to be with you all today. This is my fourth trip to Texas in the last month. I've been to College Station. A week before that, I was in Abilene at the Grace Museum. I was in Canyon on Thursday, and here I am in San Antonio, the heart of Texas art, on this day. And so I'm blessed to be here. I even made a little side journey to Smithville, Texas, thanks to Bill Reeves' inability to drive the car where we were going. And Linda Reeves' frustration with Bill with her navigational device in her phone because Bill wouldn't pay attention. So we did go to Smithville briefly. It's always great to be in my beloved state of Texas, and I like to start out and remind us that this is where Bob Wills is still the king. And I'm proud to say that we finally got Bob Wills inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers at the National Cowboy Museum in April. I was at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for 31 years, as you know, and it was wonderful to hear the earlier papers on Buck Shewitz by the Reeveses. It was beautiful. Luis Jimenez, of course, I'm a great fan, and always dreamed of having the Vaquero out in front at the museum in Canyon. Judy Deaton has always been a rock star amongst all us art historians here in Texas, and I've always been a fan of Audley Dean Nichols, and I so hope that the painting of San Francisco Peak by Audley Dean Nichols at the museum up in Canyon made it into the book, partly because Mr. Ray also painted San Francisco Peak in 1923. So, I'm a little biased in that respect, you may have noticed. In 1991, I'd only been at Canyon for a couple of years and had the opportunity to interview Florence McClung. Fortunately, I saved the microcassette. Yes, we used to use those back in the prehistoric times. I saved the microcassette and eventually had it put onto a recording device and sent a copy of that to the Jerry Bywater's archive at SMU. I'd hoped to play that a little bit because it's rare that we get to hear these artists that we talk about and love, really that we get to hear them talk for themselves. And unfortunately, I couldn't find my copy. When Judy showed the picture of David McManaway's studio, it reminded me of my office that got transplanted from Canyon to Oklahoma City, and I nudged my wife and I said, see, it requires this kind of thing for a creative process, and she wasn't buying it. She says I just need to clean my office. In any case, as I said, I interviewed Florence McClung and eventually became involved with the Women Artists of Texas book that's going to come out in spring of next year, thanks to the good offices of Light and Virginia Cummins. I was blessed to be able to write the chapter on Florence McClung and on West Texas women artists. I feel very strongly about Florence McClung, and that may come through in my paper today. And so my research on her and the essay that I wrote for that forthcoming volume is really the basis for today's paper. Those of you who've attended when I give a presentation, I tend to move around a lot, so I'm going to try not to do that because I'm going to read my paper today, because I think this particular topic deserves a little more gravitas. Not saying I don't have gravitas, I'm just saying that I might get moving around, and who knows what'll happen then. Quote, "In those days, they didn't want women in the art world. They were nasty to them. So I signed my paintings F. McClung," end quotes. Florence McClung belongs at the top of the sacred circle of Lone Star regionalism. The quality of her work and her exhibition record ensure her place in the pantheon of early Texas art. I would argue that McClung is one of the most important regionalist artists in Texas during the 1930s and 1940s. However, while others of the Dallas Nine and their circle have been lauded with retrospectives, nation touring exhibitions, and multiple publications, McClung lags behind them all. No major exhibitions, no scholarly publications. McClung lags behind them all for shame. For shame. Moreover, using another paradigm, while her work commands prices equal to her male counterparts on the commercial market, scholars have shied away from a careful examination of her earned place in Texas art history, save for a little-known master's thesis at Southern Methodist University. Is Florence McClung still being subjected to the same type of sexism she experienced during her career? McClung's exhibition career and the critical review of her work stand up against any artist in Texas or in other parts of the United States, for that matter, during the 1930s and 40s. In 1928, the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts held the first Allied Arts exhibition of Dallas County. Women artists such as Adele Laura Brunet, Laura Buchanan, Anne Guillot, and Florence McClung dominated the early Allied Arts exhibitions. Many North Texas artists subscribed to the new tenets of regionalism, borrowed heavily from John Dewey, George Santayana, and described by Henry Nash Smith, editor of Southern Methodist University's regional journal, Southwest Review. Smith wrote of an art which is firmly enough rooted in its own earth to command attention from the world. These artists soon founded the Dallas Artists League in 1932 and began sponsoring art carnivals, complete with a Mexican orchestra and African-American band. Among these, the young Turks, so to speak. These artists were Florence McClung, Nina Peoples, Alice Kramer, Maggie Jo Watson, and Velma Davis. And you'll notice the married names of all three of these women, who were also very well-accomplished painters in their own right. In June 1936, the opening of the Texas Centennial Exposition at Dallas was one of the most significant cultural events in the United States. The art exhibitions at the newly opened Dallas Museum of Fine Arts were so impressive that the National Arts magazine Art Digest dedicated nearly its entire June 1936 issue, to those exhibitions. Dr. Robert Harsh from the Art Institute of Chicago and his staff assembled over 600 works of art for the general exhibition, with an entire section on Texas art, perhaps the greatest exhibition of contemporary Texas art ever assembled. Then that completed the American Art Exhibition. James Chilman, director of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, Ellsworth Woodward, president of the Southern States Art League, and Dallas painter Alexander Hogue selected 164 works for the Texas Art Exhibition by the most important artists working in Texas at that time. These were selected for the Texas section. Women dominated the Texas section at the exposition, with over 60% of the works exhibited. Nevertheless, in his introductory essay for the catalog for the Department of Fine Arts at the exposition, Dallas Museum of Fine Arts director Richard Foster Howard wrote emphatically of the, quote, strong, conscious, and alert contributions of male artists to Texas art history, without once mentioning the female artists. However, in an essay for the Southwest Review critiquing the Texas section of the Centennial, Jerry Bywater specified 19 women and 21 men who, through their continued development during the past 10 years, have achieved a distinct and valuable mode of expression. Florence McClung was among those artists singled out by Bywaters. The Texas Centennial Exposition brought the country to Dallas. Record attendance at the exposition segued into vast crowds in the art exhibitions, and the spanking new Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, aided perhaps somewhat by its air conditioning, we might think about that in this room today, saw the best of what Texas artists had to offer. Florence McClung exhibited her major oil, Lancaster Valley, in the exposition. This painting would prove to be McClung's most well-traveled, exhibited, and lauded painting, and produced for her national attention as the exemplar for the flowering of regionalists in Dallas and Texas at large. McClung continued on her role through major regional and national exhibitions when her Lancaster Valley was selected for American Art Today at the New York World's Fair in 1939. The National Art Society produced a catalog with an introduction by Holger Cahill and essays by contemporary American artists. From over 1,200 works exhibited, selected from some 25,000 entries, Lancaster Valley was among the 31 works purchased, then given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Florence McClung was the first Texas artist to receive that honor. The Texas Centennial Exposition was repackaged as a Greater Texas, in a couple of other places where it showed, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and also at the Kansas City Art Institute. Here's the catalog from the World's Fair. The Texas Centennial Exposition was repackaged as a Greater Texas and Pan American Exposition in 1937, at which 139 pieces of Texas art were exhibited. Women artists, again, made up a significant part of the exhibition. Florence McClung exhibited two major oils, Squaw Creek Valley and Jackson's Gin. In 1934, the Texas General began as a collaborative exhibition on Texas art between the Dallas Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the Whitty Museum. McClung exhibited in 1940 and 41 in what the so-called Texas-Oklahoma General, also in 1941, including her oil-defaced land. As part of the movement in the 1930s to produce original works of art affordable to all Americans, McClung became interested in printmaking after taking lessons from Alexander Hogue, and began exhibiting her prints regularly and nationally. In May 1938, while other regional printmaking groups were being established across the country, several Texas artists formed the Lone Star Printmakers, which did not allow female printmakers. A group of women artists established the Printmakers Guild in 1940, later called the Texas Printmakers, which did allow male members, eventually numbering 30 active members, including Florence McClung. The Texas Printmakers lasted until 1965. The Lone Star Printmakers had gone belly up by 1942. McClung continued to exhibit her lithographs through the 1940s, including at the National Association of Women Artists, the Laguna Beach Art Association, Seattle Art Museum, San Francisco Museum of Fine Arts, the Library of Congress, Philadelphia Print Club, and the National Academy of Design. The Philadelphia venue is especially important given that by 1940, Carl Zagrosser, a leading proponent of collecting prints, had become curator of prints at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, a position he held until 1963, one of the first of its kind in the country. McClung produced several notable wartime images and won many local and national prizes for her work. During World War II, McClung's print Homefront was selected for inclusion in the exhibition America in the War, August 1943, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1944, her print My Son, was selected from a Library of Congress exhibition for the cover of a Red Cross magazine. McClung also served as a daytime air raid warden for her street in Dallas and completed courses in air raids, first aid, nutrition, and home nursing. Newly minted director of the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, Jerry Bywaters, at the invitation of the American Federation of Arts, organized the traveling exhibition Texas Panorama from 1943 to 1945. He called the exhibition, quote, the first real introduction of artists in Texas to the nation, end quote. Bywaters selected McClung's Cypress Swamp among the 27 artists' works chosen for the tour. 6 of those artists were women. All works of art reproduced in the monograph accompanying the exhibition were by male artists. Although, to be fair, quote, in the interest of a more complete survey of contemporary art in Texas, end quote, Bywaters appended his essay with an extremely comprehensive listing of then working Texas artists, giving equal measure to women. The exhibition opened in Dallas in October 1943, then traveled to Austin, San Francisco, and Stockton, California, Bozeman and Great Falls, Montana, you gotta love that part, Denver, Williston, North Dakota, Emporia, Kansas, and concluded at McCasland, Texas in April 1945. As important as Texas Panorama was for Texas art's exposure across the United States, the exhibition also marked a subtle and not so subtle shift in many of the exhibiting artists' paintings. In fact, Rick Stewart called Texas Panorama, quote, essentially the swan song of Texas regionalism, end quote. Interestingly, McClung was already exhibiting her paintings in major national exhibitions, largely focused on regionalism by the early 1930s. As I showed you before, she showed her oil paintings at annuals in Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and the Kansas City Midwestern, beginning in 1937. This exhibition, organized and hosted by the Kansas City Art Institute since the 1920s, was overseen by none other than Thomas Hart Benton, while he chaired the painting department there from 1935 to 1941. McClung had a solo exhibition, Florence McClung one-man show, gotta love the language, of course, March through April of 1945 at the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. This is a listing of her paintings, handwritten. Although it was the language of the time, the idea of a one-man show for a female artist sounds a bit pejorative to the 21st century ear. Included in this exhibition was Triple Lender Pass. Some of you are probably quite familiar with this image. In 1946 and 1947, she served as president of the Southern States Art League and was the Texas chairman for the National Association of Women Painters. McClung stopped making art. I'll say that again. McClung stopped making art about 1950 to care for her ailing husband, Rufus McClung. She told scholar Sam Ratcliffe in an interview in 1987, quote, I couldn't take care of Rufy and paint. I couldn't get in the car and go away and leave him alone. So I stayed with the fellow that stood with me. We were crazy about each other, and we'd always been quite good friends, end quote. Think about that. She stopped making art. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, at about age 3, McClung moved with her family to Texas, where they rented a house in Oak Cliff. She, quote, kept hearing about a man who could draw cows. And though she, quote, didn't like cows to begin with, McClung was intrigued. So she told her mother, Mr. Ray knows how to paint, takes a little stick and draws a picture, and asked if she could take lessons with him. She remembered Ray was always very sweet to me because I was a dainty little girl. For her first lesson, she and Ray, quote, crossed the road and sat on a stool, and while he sketched a cow. Her first lesson with Mr. Ray was trying to draw Dallas. He also set her to work drawing trees over and over and over again, hence the slide on the screen now. Mr. Ray always had a fascination with trees, including them in virtually all of his paintings, and so his obsession with her painting trees is vital to, as he saw it, her education. Ray always took an interest in anything she'd draw, and McClung felt like he was a big brother, and I loved him very much. However, while he encouraged her art making, he admonished her about it as well, saying she could, quote, learn to paint and let it be her joy, but don't think she could live on it. Always respectful, McClung stated firmly in 1991 to me, I would be no judge of Mr. Ray's work. McClung graduated from Bryan High School in Dallas. She married Pierce Flack in 1912, and they were divorced in 1914. She married cotton broker Rufus McClung in 1917, and they reared a son, Elliott. McClung enrolled in a free still life painting class under Jesse Davis at Dallas Technical High School about 1918. She felt Davis had not received enough, quote, credit in Dallas for a lot of hard work, and I would agree. Jesse Davis deserves better study and attention. McClung began work under Frank Klepper after seeing an exhibition of his work in Dallas. A couple of examples of Klepper's work as an impressionist. And this ultimately affected some of the work that McClung did in this impressionist vein and using these particular strategies. However, she then studied at the Art Institute of Dallas under Olin Travis, Catherine Hale Travis, and especially Thomas Stell. This is a still life made by McClung when she was under the tutelage of Thomas Stell. McClung studied about 6 months with Tom Stell, but didn't like him at all. I'll read that quote more clearly. Quote, didn't like Stell at all. His classes included nearly all male students, and she did not enjoy the nude models. However, Stell made her conscious of and taught her a lot about form. And I think this little stroll here, when we compare McClung's fabulous Magnolia with the Portrait of Dale Hurd by Thomas Stell, and perhaps a couple of other Texas regionalist women, Kathleen Blackshear and May Scow, and perhaps maybe even think about her work in the larger vein of Lone Star regionalism, including a Russell Vernon Hunter painting called Cowman. Perhaps her lessons of form were really rather profound if we think about the full pantheon of Texas regionalism. In 1929, John H. Burma, president of Trinity University at Waxahachie, offered a teaching position to McClung. Now remember, Trinity was originally in Waxahachie and then moved here to San Antonio in 1942. She declared, telling him, I don't want to teach, I want to paint. Ironically, offering a university teaching position to a married woman was rather unorthodox at this time, as across the United States, around 50% of female college or university faculty would be dismissed upon getting married. McClung accepted and headed the Trinity Art Department until 1942, 13 years. She drove on unpaved roads between Dallas and Waxahachie 3 times per week. Consequently, McClung frequently painted the surrounding countryside, resulting in her most famous canvas, Lancaster Valley and Ellis County landscape, in the Panhandle Plains collection. About 1931 or 32, McClung began studying under Alexander Hogue in, quote, a little telephone building in Oaklawn, and later in Taos, New Mexico. McClung recalled, quote, I went 4 summers to Taos in the early 1930s to study under Alexander Hogue. She recalled him fondly. He was just like a brother. She also affirmed that he was a very good teacher, the best teacher I've ever found. Conversely, Hogue remembered McClung as very busy, very eager, and she would really go after whatever she wanted to be about, end quote. During a visit to Panhandle Plains Historical Society Museum in 1991, Hogue saw hanging in the Texas Gallery there McClung's 1936 oil early mast house, with its very Hogue-like rendering of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the background. He commented to me with no small amount of pride that she was one of his students. Hogue provided a bridge for McClung to interact with the founders and members of the Taos Society of Artists, which had dissolved by 1927. McClung recalled in 1985 her, quote, many happy hours in the studios and homes of Kausch, Sharp, Burt Phillips, Burninghouse, Dunton, Hennings, Isla, and Elmo McAfee Turner. She also befriended printmaker Jean Kloss and her husband Phillips. McClung called Isla McAfee Turner my closest friend. McAfee painted murals at Edmond, Oklahoma, and Clifton, Texas. This is Clifton, Texas on the screen now, and was a prolific painter and printmaker of animal and Native American subjects. She maintained her White Horse studio on Armory Street at Taos until 1993 with her famous performing Magic Cat. McClung's body of work, based on her Taos experience, includes major paintings and lithographs, such as Rio Grande, which is a lithograph, Taos, a woodcut, and of course, early Mass Taos. When McClung handed early Mass Taos to me as a donation to the Panhandle Plains Museum in 1991, she was a little abashed that she had to recreate the small church in the middle ground from memory, as the church had already burned by the time she painted the scene. Unwittingly, perhaps, she was echoing the great Grant Wood's sentiments about giving new life to old fables. In 1935, at age 40, McClung enrolled at Southern Methodist University, where she earned a BA in English, a BA in art, and a BS in education on the same day in 1939. McClung secured an art scholarship through SMU, art instructor Olive Donaldson, because of her knowledge in firing ceramics in a kiln she learned from Jesse Davis. So she began her academic studies, going full-time in the summer term of 1935, followed by classes 3 days a week, including Saturdays. Imagine that today. She studied English under John H. McGinnis. Let's see, back up. Well, you saw McGinnis's picture. who edited the Southwest Review and was an English professor for nearly 20 years and helped found the SMU Press in 1937. Because of her interest in geology, McClung also sought and earned a degree in science education. She continued her studies at the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center in the late 1930s and early 1940s to improve her lithographs. Having worked with the notoriously difficult Joseph Imhoff at Taos, she traveled to Colorado Springs to work with Lawrence Barrett and Adolph Dane, both prominent lithographers at the time. Although lifelong learner has become something of a tagline in today's society, in today's academia, McClung truly exemplified this philosophy. Moreover, continuing to improve their game was part and parcel for most female artists throughout history. In order to stay relevant, moreover, women artists tended to be far more experimental than their male counterparts. Her art studies continued in New York, probably with Dallasite Martha Simpkins, and she may have studied at the Cincinnati Art Institute, but that's yet to be confirmed. However, she did complete 9 credit hours towards a master's in art at Texas State College for Women in 1939. She truly was a lifelong learner. When asked in 1991 about the prejudices she faced in Dallas in the 1930s and 1940s, she retorted quickly, quote, "I don't want to get mixed up in it. I know too much," end quote. Now remember that I'm 4 years into my career at this time, and like any good young novice art historian, I want to get in and find something juicy, and she wouldn't have it. She was too much of a lady to take the bait. She was just too much of a lady on that day to smear anyone. Nevertheless, her painting Lancaster Valley and the notice it received, coupled with a potentially conscious effort to diminish McClung's success because of this painting, reveal a far more unfortunate side to Lone Star regionalism that has gone largely ignored by scholars. Graduate student Kimberly Haley, in her SMU thesis on McClung, devoted considerable attention investigating Lancaster Valley's role in McClung's cries of sexism. However, a careful examination of her thesis reveals the dangers of uncareful citations of sources. The town of Lancaster, Texas, lays a little east of due south, 15 miles from downtown Dallas. McClung probably used unpaved Road 6 from and to Dallas most of the time, an area of rolling prairies dotted with small family farms. As she later recalled, quote, "I was down there 13 years just riding up and down that road. You get tired of it, so you just paint whatever you see." Describing her attraction to the site depicted in her Lancaster Valley painting, McClung remembered, quote, "I realize now it was a 2-story home, and the barns right there by it, and all the land as it went, and yet the reason I painted it was because it was wood that is seasoned through the ages, and I wanted to see if you could ever get or capture that gray blue. That was why I worked on that. That's Lancaster," end quote. She exhibited Lancaster Valley at the Texas Centennial Exposition, as I've showed you before. The following year, she was invited to send it to the annual exhibition of American art at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. McClung also sent the painting to the annual Midwestern exhibition at Kansas City Art Institute that I showed you before. She may have sent Lancaster Valley and Squaw Creek Valley exhibition to the 50th anniversary of the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors in 1939, but this is yet to be confirmed. Most importantly for this paper, Lancaster Valley was part of the American Art Today exhibition at the New York World's Fair in 1939, but that is not where the trouble started. Texas entries for American Art Today were sent for a preview and jurying at the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. Jerry Bywaters, Alexander Hogue, Mary Marshall comprised the painting committee for Texas, chaired by Dallas Museum of Fine Art director Richard Foster Howard. Howard also chaired the sculpture committee of Dorothy Austin, William McVeigh, and Allie Victoria Tennant. Hogue also served on the prints committee with Edward Eisenlohr, Margaret Ann Scruggs, and James Chilman. The painters selected for American Art Today included Bywaters, Otis Dozier, William Lester, Perry Nichols, H.O. Robertson, Everett Spruce, and McClung. Hogue exhibited in the print section along with Merritt Maze, Blanche McVeigh, Scruggs, Caruth. Austin, Octavio Medellin, and Tennant comprised the Texas sculpture. Regionalism represented Texas. The catalog's contributors included Holdert Cahill, a prolific arts writer, who also served briefly as acting director of the Museum of Modern Art, and was then National Director of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project. Cahill and Dorothy Miller, his first assistant and later his wife, who would become a curator at MoMA, curated American art today. Cahill wrote in his essay about regional painters tending, quote, toward the formation of an attitude, toward the recognized trend in observation, sentiment, and even technique, happening today in the Middle West, and even more in the Southwest, especially in Texas, toward the development of a regional point of view, end quote. In June 1939, Cahill wrote in the New York Times, quote, Lancaster Valley by Florence McClung of Texas is a painting which evidences a definite trend in observation, technique, and sentiment. When these factors are fused into an emotional unity, we have the beginning of a regional school, end quote. Clearly, Cahill saw McClung's work in Lancaster Valley as a linchpin for regionalism in Texas. 6 months later, Jerry Bywaters wrote in the Southwest Review, quote, in an article called Toward an American Art, he quoted parts of Cahill's essay. Haley wrote in her master's thesis that, quote, Bywaters borrowed Cahill's words and in doing so revealed bias and perhaps jealousy. Moreover, Haley charged that Bywaters went on to paraphrase Cahill, leaving out the reference to McClung. True, Bywaters did not cite Cahill's references to McClung from the latter's New York Times article remarks because Bywaters quoted from Cahill's American Art Today essay, not from the New York Times. In her thesis, Haley also cites the very telling next sentence, quote, at which, quote, Bywaters lists Hoag, Dozier, Spruce, and Lester as good examples of the types of artists Cahill described, end quote. The difficulty here is that the next sentence in Bywaters' essay is a quotation from J. Peyton Boswell's Jr.'s Modern American Painting that begins, quote, wherever there is American life, says Mr. Boswell. Furthermore, and in fact, Bywaters' very telling next sentence, air quotes, and his, quote, list of fellow Lone Star regionalists also comes from Boswell. Quote, in Texas, the tragedy of soil erosion is Alexander Hoag's message, while life in the Ozarks is the special domain of Everett Spruce. Depicting the Southwest generally are Jerry Bywaters and William Lester. Behind the sagebrush of the desert is Otis Dozier, end quote. Later in his essay, Bywaters did, in fact, cite certain Texas artists, including Fort Worth's Blanche McVeigh, Mary Marshall, and Cora Stafford of Denton, and Stella Lodge Lamond of SMU. The jealousy Haley writes of likely did occur, but only after Lancaster Valley was purchased and transferred to the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When Haley interviewed Hoag in 1994, he indicated, quote, he had been quite envious of the honor and imagined that Bywaters had been as well. She quoted Hoag's repetition of the old saw about women artists being unable to devote themselves to their art full time due to family responsibilities. You probably noticed I showed a slide of Maggie Jo Watson, aka Mrs. Alexander Hoag. Haley correctly asserts that, quote, proving the emotions or intentions of a person in these circumstances would be impossible, end quote. Conversely, her declaration that actions do, however, reveal an injustice, if her summation is based on Bywaters' actions, cited incorrectly in her thesis, then the grinding of her acts on behalf of McClung drowns out serious consideration. This brings to mind the zeal of those who right all the wrongs of the past, often unprovable and unproven and unprovable, by tearing down. I would rather see a building up, constructive rather than destructive, by direct comparison and balance in any discourse on societal, social, and cultural injustices. Haley is correct to cite the rampant biases towards women artists that clearly existed historically and contemporaneous with McClung's success. Thomas Craven, in particular, deserves vilification for his 1931 Men of Art and 1934 Modern Art, The Men, the Movement, the Meaning. His 1925 article, Men of Art, American Style, is especially disturbing and hammers this point home. Quote, painting is essentially a man's art, and all the great painters have been coarse, earthy, and intolerable. In the entire range of art, there is not a single picture entitled to a moment's consideration that has been done by a woman. End quote. Haley again, and rightly so, placed McClung in the context of widespread sexism toward women artists that continues today. Most importantly, she states firmly, quote, despite what might be perceived as discouraging prospects, McClung followed her urge to paint and exhibit, end quote. As her fellow Texas printmaker and friend Barbara Maples indicated, Florence was a mover and a shaker. There was nothing timid about her. She did a lot for women artists as she came before us and was very ambitious and always pushing, end quote. Florence McClung clearly followed Gertrude Stein's line of reasoning, let me listen to me and not to them. Throughout her life, Florence McClung was an active and productive member of the Dallas and Texas art scene. Her work can be seen at many museums across the United States, including the National Gallery of Art, Library of Congress, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Amon Carter Museum of American Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Dallas Museum of Art, Meadows Museum, and the Panhandle Plains Historical Society Museum in Canyon, as well as other museums in Texas. She died in 1992 at the age of 97 in the city she adopted as her home. Born in Missouri, McClung studied throughout her life with some of the leading artists and teachers in Texas, including Frank Ray, Jesse Davis, Alexander Hogue, Olin and Catherine Hale Travis, Thomas Stell, Frank Klepper, Martha Simpkins, and at SMU, and the Texas State College for Women. A Women of the Texas Printmaker, she exhibited in the Fort Worth Annual, the Texas Allied Arts, the Texas Centennial, the Greater Texas and Pan American, and the 1939 World's Fair, as well as major invitationals across the nation. In more recent times, McClung was one of 3 women included in the exhibition Lone Star Regionalism in 1985. Yet, and with all due respect to its author, she receives 1 paragraph of examination on 1 page in the contextual essay in that seminal publication. 1 paragraph. Really? McClung even realized this, quote, it just amazed me that they put me in that Lone Star Regionalism show because men are still jealous of the women, end quote. Her sense of mission of why she painted was equally acute. In the interview Sam Ratcliffe conducted with Florence, this is Sam asking questions and Florence answering them. Sam, now why did you want to paint? Florence, because I wanted children 100 years from now to know how Texas looked in this day and time, because now as you see our country, we are filling it up with people, and it was beautiful rolling country when I started. Sam, so were you initially attracted to West Texas? Florence, I like open spaces. But it didn't make any difference. I've sat down there on Lower Lamar and did the old Bryant Candy Cracker Company because that was the way Dallas was then. Everything that I've painted has been with the idea of showing people in the future what Dallas was like or what the country was like, Texas was like, more Texas than anything, end quote. Kimberly Summer Haley wrote in her 1992 thesis, Florence McClung, A Southwest Vision, that McClung did not travel, nor did she study what the best-known regionalists did in New York and New Mexico. What the best-known regionalists did in New York, Kansas, Missouri, or even Oklahoma. It was the art, culture, and landscape of Texas and New Mexico that had the greatest impact on her work. I beg to differ that McClung was a student all her life, and indeed well-traveled and consistent with female artists of her generation, constantly sought to improve her art so as to stay relevant by strategic submissions to contemporary exhibitions in Philadelphia, New York, Kansas, Missouri, and even Oklahoma. She remained current with what other regionalists were doing, Grant Wood, and of course, her studies under Alexander Hogue could not have disallowed her from knowing what Mr. Hogue was doing with his Dust Bowl series, Mother Earth Laid Bare, for example, nor what Travis was doing in his metaphorical use as the female form in Wilderness, nor even with Arthur Durston's work out in California, where he paints a personification of California as a painted-up woman with hollow eyes and plenty of makeup. Perhaps that's a symbol of today, I don't know. Make up your own mind. But She certainly was aware of what Wood was doing, perhaps not the femininity that he saw in the Iowa landscape, but she certainly saw the rolling prairies that she talked about, and very much in line with the belief of the femininity of the beautiful landscape as codified in the 1780s by scholars in Great Britain and Scotland that carried over across the Atlantic and found their way into American art. And as you can see from Squaw Creek Valley, compared to Spring Plowing by Grant Wood, she is very, very much aware of what was happening in other parts of the U.S., as well as John Stuart Curry in Kansas. So Iowa, Kansas, Missouri. I'm afraid I don't have an Oklahoma slide to show you. But even in New Mexico, she was well aware of what was going on with Russell Vernon Hunter, of course, who lived back and forth between Farwell and Texaco, New Mexico, on the New Mexico line, with his West Texas town in the Panhandle Plains collection, compared to her Carrollton Depot or Carrollton Station, which one little part of Lone Star regionalism, or regionalism in particular, there is always a little bit of macabre going on, a little surrealism going on. Notice the little girl swinging all alone on this very empty West Texas street, and then the lone figure over here on this side of the tracks, perhaps the wrong side of the tracks. So, something perhaps due for study in a Texas surrealism show. I don't know, somebody smarter than me is going to have to do that. Haley also observed that, quote, highways, crowds, and skyscrapers are among the elements of modern life she elected not to show. On the other hand, McClung's seminal triple underpass was likely not available to this scholar when she wrote those lines. Moreover, McClung's depictions of cotton gins and grain elevators were just as much skyscrapers, a couple of more images of Dallas, were just as much skyscrapers in part of the Texas landscape to her as they were to her fellow regionalist and precisionist Charles Sheeler in his classic Landscape from 1930, depicting the Ford Motor Company plant on the River Rouge in Detroit, and even earlier Charles Demas, Aucassin and Nicolette, and perhaps even My Egypt from the late 1920s, using romantic language to underscore the romanticism and uniqueness of an American landscape that was dotted with grain elevators and water towers and windmills. Does this not put McClung's work and the accolades it gleaned squarely in the broader conversation of American scene painting across the United States? McClung also held her own high standards and respect for her contributions, and was yet pragmatic and awed by her successes. Quote, I can say I was never turned down by a jury. I never had a painting turned down. Now, it may have been that I waited until I was good and didn't know it, but I'd stand up to those juries just as sure that they were going to get in, and they did. And now that I think of it, that's odd. It's a wonder I wasn't turned down sometime, end quote. Clearly, others outside Texas saw in her work what some tried hard not to see. For an article in Southwest Art Magazine in 1993, on the occasion of the exhibition Women Artists of Texas, 1850 to 1950, at Panhandle Plains Historical Society Museum, I wrote, quote, reliance upon more balanced scales of history and aesthetics will hopefully force our public institutions to dust off those paintings, prints, and sculptures languishing in storage and place the work of women artists on exhibit. Good art has no gender, end quote. Kimberly Summer Haley placed this quotation alone and squarely on single front matter page in her thesis. I had forgotten I had written this until I opened her thesis at Hammond Arts Library at SMU a few years ago, and it hit me like a ton of bricks right between the eyes, and the moment deserves mixed metaphors and hyperbole. I, too, had let down Florence McClung. Ironically, I had a handwritten reminder to organize and curate a McClung retrospective on my bulletin board for over 30 years at Panhandle Plains Museum, and discussed it with powerful Texas collectors, many of whom are in this room, who all gushed and enthused over such a thing being vital and imperative. She wasn't one of the boys, and that has harmed her standing in the wider world of early Texas art. Talk is cheap. Enough is enough. She was and is one of Texas' finest. Holger Cahill saw it in 1939. The boys saw it too and couldn't stand it. To quote fan dancer Sally Rand, who appeared at the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial Exposition in 1936, quote, "Whatever happens, never happens by itself. Let's get it done for Florence." Thank you.